Bobby the Brain. Chapter 4. Back to the AWA. I went back to the AWA around Thanksgiving of 1979. I did an angle with Lord Alfred Hayes where his man, Super Destroyer Mark II, who would go on to be Sergeant Slaughter, turned on him and introduced me as his new manager. We ended the storyline a few months later when Alfred lost a loser leaves town match to me. I never found out why Alfred left. He was a dear friend of mine. He went to Montreal, and the poor man wound up managing Billy Robinson. He almost went nuts because Robinson was such an obnoxious Englishman. He always worked stiff, actually hurting his opponents instead of pulling his punches. I told him one day, "Billy, everything you do in the ring is beautiful. And it hurts." Nick and I also reunited, and he was named the AWA World Champion again after Vern defeated him and retired in 1981. I told Vern once, if you beat Nick one more time, you get to keep him. Nick would go on to lose the title to Otto Wands in August of the next year. What a piece of shit Wands was. That whole situation was a scam. Nick didn't tell me the finish that night. He gave me another finish. I walked out to the ring with him, and Wally Carbo was sitting ringside. It was weird because Wally never sat out there. Otto was stumbling around the ring like he usually did, and they went to the finish where Nick banged his head into the turnbuckle and fell back with Otto with both their shoulders on the mat. Otto raised his shoulder and beat Nick. I jumped into the ring and ran over to Larry Losowski, the referee. Keep in mind that I'm still working. Wally ran behind me and grabbed me, yelling, "Don't hit him! Don't hit him!" I said, "Why would I hit him?" "Because Nick lost," Carbo said. I was working. I told him, I don't care if Nick lost or Nick won. I got in the ring as Nick was pulling himself up from the second rope, and he asked, "What happened?" I said, "You lost the belt, Nick." I must have hit my head. I walked back to the dressing room with him. He was still acting groggy. "Nick, quit working," I told him. "That was a rib on you," he said. "I knew you were working," I said, "because you grabbed the second rope and you knew where it was." "What are you ribbing me for?" I found out later that Vern told Nick not to tell anyone the finish, not even me. The reason they switched the belt to Otto is because whoever was the champion in Otto's little Disney world he lived in got the return match in Austria. The last champion Vern, that the now former champion Nick, defeated got to be the new champion's Otto manager. Vern and his wife got a trip to Austria. I didn't go. Another time I saw something like that was when Dick Murdoch was double-crossed in St. Louis in a match against the Bruiser. They told Bruiser that he was going to beat Murdoch. They told Murdoch that he was going to lose the first fall but take the second fall, and in the third fall they would go to the time limit. Dick Murdoch lost the first fall, and that was it. It was only a one-fall match. Murdoch never knew. I was really insulted when Wands beat Nick. They told me a different finish where Nick would go over on Wands. Nick told me a different finish, and I'm still not over it. I should be, I guess. Otto was such an idiot. He was in Japan with us and we all went to this German bar in Tokyo. They bring you these big bones with meat on them and piles of potato pancakes. Otto would eat so much that he couldn't fit it on the table. He'd put the potato pancakes on a chair next to him. When he was stuffing his face with this food all around him, I would take 3 or 4 toilet paper sheets and put them in the sweatband of his hat. After 2 weeks, his hat would be sitting on top of his head like he was Lou Costello. He thought he was gaining weight in his head. Not being told the finish of a match was a major indignity, but it was not the only indignity I would suffer in my career. We were sitting in the dressing room one night, and I was getting ready to go on vacation for a week. I jokingly said, "I'll probably come back to find out you guys have a weasel suit you got me wrestling in." A light must have gone off in Vern's head as he was listening to me. I continued, "I could throw Greg, his son in, load my tail, and hit him." "Load your tail?" Vern asked. "I'm just kidding," I said. I came back from vacation and Wally told me, "You're not going to believe this, pal. I've got my brother making you a weasel suit." A comment in a dressing room had come true. His brother measured me for a weasel suit that had a tail, feet, and a zipper. I had hot pants matches with the Crusher in the late 60s. I was managing Blackjack Lancet at the time, and the stipulation was that if Crusher beat Jack, he'd get to put me in hot pants. So, Crusher obviously would beat Jack, knock me out cold, and slide the hot pants on. I would wake up and find these orange pants on me. I'd try to get them off of me, and I'd trip and fall. The first match with the weasel suit was in St. Paul. Greg asked me what the finish was. I told him that he was going to beat me and put me in the suit. Their first idea was for Greg to pin me quickly. Why would I get in the suit then? I asked. The brain would tell you to stick it up your ass. The promoters asked me, how are you going to get in it? I reassured them just let him beat me. Greg beat me that night, and of course I refused to put the suit on. Referee Marty Miller gave me to the count of 10 to put the suit on. I walked away, Greg ran out, nailed me, and rolled me back in the ring. He picked me up in the ring and put me in his sleeper hold. I would wake up real groggy and then start to stare at my hands. Only I had paws. Then I saw I had a tail. So I would start chasing my tail and take bumps in the ring. Wally's brother made the bottoms of the feet real slick, so I was slipping all over the ring. I finally got the suit off, threw it in the air, and walked underneath it. It would land on me, and I would start fighting it all over again. I wasn't the only one trying to rip that suit off. One night in Peoria, I was lying out cold in the ring, and some mark came by and ripped my tail off. Greg was a good weasel suit opponent, but he never became the AWA World Champion like his father did. Vern never made Greg the champion because he wanted only one world champion in the Gagne family. Vern could have had that kid in wrestling school and hired Dan Gable and others to teach Greg to shoot. Shoot is wrestling slang for actually punching and kicking, as opposed to the loose pro wrestling style, not with Vern. Greg was tag team champion and international television champion, but that was it. Greg and Jim Brunzell were members of the High Flyers and held the AWA World Tag Team title. They always got along, but Brunzell always felt that he would never be treated as well as Greg was. That wasn't going to happen because Greg was Vern's son. Period. Jim felt like the second banana. Jim wanted to wrestle as a single and face Nick for the heavyweight title. He went to Charlotte for a while, but he wasn't as over as he was in the AWA. Remember, if a promoter wants you over, you'll get over. Brunzell trained at Vern's school and paid Vern a percentage of money for so many years for the training. As far as I know, Brunzell was one of the only wrestlers to live up to that agreement. Vern got his money from other sources as well. He used to sell this product called Geraspeed, a vitamin supplement. It sold pretty well. He was wrestling in Detroit around the late 50s or early 60s. Before a match he was going to have with Vern, Bruiser found this old, dirty bum outside the building. He offered the guy $20 to wait outside the door. When it came time for Dick's interview, he found the guy, who had since fallen asleep or passed out. Bruiser slung the guy over his shoulder, brought him to the set, and told everyone that this guy had been on Geraspeed for 5 years and look how much he improved his health. Another weasel suit opponent back then was Buck Rock and Roll Zumhofe. I watched him one night with his jumpsuit and the big radio he carried around and thought to myself, I could make money with this kid. I really didn't know Zumhofe, but I thought I could have some fun with him. We had an angle in the early 80s where I was wrestling Kenny J on television and Buck came out with his radio. I turned to him and Kenny rolled me up for the pin. I acted mad and was ready to fight Zumhofe. He put the radio down, but the dummy didn't have the back on it, and all the batteries rolled out. The music that was supposed to be irritating me suddenly stopped. So I just kicked him in the head. Although we didn't wrestle in weasel suit matches, I worked against Brad Reingens, who was a former Olympic wrestler. Wrestling Brad was like wrestling a cab. He wouldn't bend. He couldn't move. It was the worst. It was like working with a refrigerator. I wrestled Brad in his third match in Ladysmith, Wisconsin. They wanted me to do the job for him. Of course. I'd do anything I could just to get the match over with. You couldn't bend him or anything. He was so strong and he had that mentality of shooting. There were 100 people in the arena that night. He beat me and started leaving the ring. I shouted, "Hey, asshole." "What?" he asked. He couldn't hear me. "You asshole." He got in the ring. "Take your straps down," I demanded. "What?" I said, "Take your straps down, asshole." He took his straps down. I took mine down too. I said, "Put 'em up. Put 'em up, asshole." He put up his fists. I looked at the crowd and shouted. The guy does anything I tell him, and I left. I would really mess with Reingens in the ring. Usually when you are wrestling a guy and you want to hit him and have him hit you back, you'd say 1, 2. I'd get Brad in the ropes and say 1, and hit him. He'd try to hit me back. I'd say, I said 1. And he'd stop in mid-punch. I would have him in a headlock and call a high spot. Usually I'd say, shoot me in, hit me with a tackle, jump over me, get it again. So I told Brad, 1 tackle. Don't get it again. I'd shoot him in, he'd hit me with a tackle. He'd come off the other ropes. I said not to get it, I'd say. He'd stop. But wrestling that cab sure beat Mad Dog Vachon pounding on me. He was violent. I was wrestling him one night in Hamburg behind Zumhof's house near a railroad track. The dog dragged me to the track and laid my neck across it. He said, "Stay here." I asked, "How long?" "Until the fucking train comes," he growled. You would have to let dog beat on you and let him know you could take it to get his respect. They did like Jesse Ventura and Billy Graham. He always said they're pussies. They can't take it. When Mad Dog chopped, he didn't just chop. He had small hands or paws, like little shovels that would rip into your flesh. When Mad Dog won the AWA belt in Texas, the promoters were going to have him drop it to Billy Graham. Graham gave it back, saying, "Brother, I don't need this. A guy could get hurt out there." Violence also defined Frank Goodish, who wrestled as Bruiser Brody. But Frank was always out to screw promoters because he was another guy convinced that they wanted to screw him. We had a show at the Showboat in Las Vegas. Someone had gotten sick before the show started. A custodian cleaned it up with a mop, put the mop in a bucket, and left it out in the hall. Goodish found it as he was walking out to the ring. He stood in the ring with this wet mop full of vomit and started throwing it around at the people. Who was going to come back to a show with that? He missed shots. He went to Chicago once and, because no one picked him up at the hotel, he turned around and went home. In Indianapolis, I gave him the finish for his match with Jim Brunzell. He was supposed to go 20 minutes and get disqualified. He didn't wrestle 1 minute. He walked out with a cartload of chairs, knocked the ringside seats over, and went out into the stands. The referee asked, "What should I do?" I told him to count him out. He wrestled Nick once for Paul Boesch in Houston, Texas, and he actually behaved himself. He didn't know Nick, and he liked Boesch because he paid a lot of money. Boesch was the best payoff guy in the business and a very fair guy. He would always pay me in cash with a big envelope compared to the ones I got in St. Louis, which I could slide under a door. Frank was not about to blow Houston because he was from Texas and he wanted to work around there. He would never stay in a territory. He'd go in and out. When he'd come in and stick it to a promoter, he never realized that there were guys underneath working that territory who depended on that once a month big show for money. He didn't understand that if he went in and screwed it up for that promoter, he was screwing all the little guys at the bottom too. That's why I never had any respect for Frank Goodish. It was enjoyable working for Vern, and I didn't have any problem with him. He was fair with me, and the only conflict I had was when I left for the WWF. It's funny. I called Vince McMahon Sr. before I went to Japan in 1983. I'd call him every 6 months about coming in, but he wouldn't use me. He had Lou Albano, Grand Wizard, and Fred Blassie. The last time I talked to him, he said, "Something big is going to happen, and I can't use you now. There'd really be trouble, but you'll hear about it." He wouldn't tell me what was up. When I went to Japan, he died of cancer, but he had already sold his promotion to his son, Vince McMahon Jr. Vern didn't want me to leave, but I wanted to because Vince McMahon made me an offer I couldn't refuse. It was almost double my pay. I was going to do the TV from Madison Square Garden on the MSG channel. It was a chance to do more things. I was 44 and ready to make a change. I didn't want to work past 50. I could see with Vince McMahon's imagination and his television product that he was better than P.T. Barnum. Even the boys in the AWA watched his tapes. It was exciting. It was different. I had an opportunity to go with Hulk Hogan, Gene Okerlund, and David Schultz. Vince made me feel like a star. Vern was a wrestler. Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder were wrestlers. Everyone has their own feelings about Vince, but he was always fair to me. He always made me feel like I was worth something. Some promoters would talk down to their workers, but not Vince. Vern was so mad when Vince was taking over. He claimed that he was going to run Brooklyn against Vince. I told him there was no place to run there. He needed to upgrade his product. I said, "There are 4 gas stations on 4 corners. No promoter owns anything. No one owns a town. He has the right to go there. Vince has the right to come here." He didn't like to hear that, but it was the truth. I never quite found out if this was true, but the Iron Sheik told me that when he went to New York and beat Bob Backlund for the WWF title, the next show was supposed to be Sheik and Backlund in a return match. That's what Backlund thought. It was actually Sheik versus Hulk Hogan at the next show where Hogan was going to get the belt. Arnold Scotland went to the ring with Backlund that night, and during the match, Iron Sheik got Backlund in a camel clutch. Scotland threw the towel in, but Backlund didn't know anything about it. Scotland was told by the WWF to do it. I don't know if that was a way to protect Backlund so he didn't have to give up, but Backlund was upset about it. On top of that, he didn't get the return match. Hogan did. Sheik told me that after he won the belt, Vince was going to go national and have his television all over the place. Vern called Sheik and said, "You come to Minneapolis with the belt, and I'll put you over Nick Bockwinkel. You'll be the AWA champion and the WWF champion. We'll unify it to the AWA championship. Plus, I'll give you $100,000. Sheik thought about it. He told me, "Vern Gagne started me, but he never made any money for me. Vince McMahon Sr. has always taken care of me and gave me the belt. I've made good money with him." He turned Vern down and told Vince Sr. about the phone call. That's why you will always see the Iron Sheik used by the McMahon family. They appreciated his loyalty. Again, I don't know if it's true or not, but I suspect it is. Hulk Hogan's departure from the AWA started when he came back from Japan in 1983. He didn't want to work for Vern because of some discrepancy over t-shirt money. The AWA sold all our t-shirts, but we never got a dime for anything. No one did that I know of except for maybe his son Greg. Vern even made up a Battle Royal shirt once with all our faces on it. The AWA was scared that Hogan was going to try something during his last match with Nick Bockwinkel for the AWA title in St. Paul toward the end of 1983. They even gave Nick 2 finishes. I just laughed, saying, "This isn't going to happen. This is business." Hogan never showed up for that match. He had signed with the WWE. David Schultz, another wrestler, didn't show up either, and Vern fired him. David got a little mad about that, to say the least. I was out back having a cigarette outside the television studio. Everybody was on lunch break when Schultz walked by me, saying, "Hi, Bobby." He was wearing a baseball cap, pants tucked into his cowboy boots, rodeo gloves, and a lumberjack coat. This guy looked ready to fight. The only people left in the studio were Billy Graham, Blackjack Lanza, and Vern and Greg Gagne. Schultz walked into the studio, went right up to Vern, and said, "Don't you tell anybody I was fired because I quit. I sent you a telegram last night." "Get the hell out of here before I have you thrown out," Vern yelled. "You ain't gonna do nothing to me, you old bald-headed man," Schultz shouted. Vern looked at him and realized that he was in a television station. He didn't want to lose his show over a brawl. He walked out to get some assistance. Greg shouted at Schultz, "I'll go with you." Graham and Lanza held him back, which was a good idea, or Vern would have been planning a funeral for his son. Schultz finally left, but he was wound up tighter than a cheap watch and ready to go. And that wasn't the end of the departures. Gene Okerlund left soon after that. The AWA had its number 1 babyface gone, a top heel, and a top announcer. Their main guys remaining were Bockwinkel, Greg Gagne, and Vern. I was next. When I was ready to leave the AWA, I called Hogan and told him I wanted to go to New York. They had already asked me 3 or 4 times. He said, "Call me back in 5 minutes. I called him back. He said, "I just talked to Vince. When you get home, call him." I called Vince on a Friday night from Denver. I couldn't take it anymore and wanted to make a change. The AWA was going down, and Vince was really on a run. I saw what the wrestlers were making from the WWF. I wanted to make that run. I had a good money offer and was treated with respect. I wanted to be a part of it. After I accepted the offer from Vince, I called Vern at home. His wife told me that he was over visiting Greg and his grandson. I called Greg's house and asked him if Vern was there. Greg said no. Why? "Well, I need to talk to him about something." "Is it anything important?" he asked. I figured Vern was there, so I cut to the chase. I was made an offer by the WWE. "Oh, those bastards. They're after it again," he grumbled. "I'm going to take it," I said. "It's a substantial offer." Strangely, Greg said, "Go ahead." I asked him later why he said that. Greg said, "Because usually the guy won't go. 9 out of 10 times, we win." Smart mentality. I guess Greg found Vern, because he called me back quickly. "What is it, Bobby?" he asked. "There's something I want to talk to you about. The WWF called and they made me an offer." "Oh, those bastards. They're after it again," he said, mimicking Greg. "I'm going to accept the offer." "You're what?" "I'm going to accept the offer." "Tell it to me face to face." Vern said. "Are you going to be in the office this afternoon around 1 minutes?" I asked. "Yes." I hung up the phone and told my wife Cindy, "I'm going in to give my notice." I really didn't know what they would do to me. Vern lost Hogan, Okerlund, and Schultz. He was going to lose me, which meant that Nick wouldn't have anybody. He lost Nick's main opponent and his manager. It would be a big dent. But Vince's ratings were going up. He was getting more popular every week. Before I went to the office, I made a blade to protect myself. They didn't know it then, but they will now if they read this. I greeted Mary Ellen, who was Vern's sister-in-law and the secretary. She was a very nice lady. I walked into Vern's office and kept my hands in my pockets the whole time. Vern shut the door, turned around, and said to Greg, "Let's get him and throw him out the window." We were up 20 floors. I sat down on the couch and said, "Go ahead. You'll make my wife a very wealthy woman." They both sat down, one on each side of me. "We're just kidding," Vern said. "Tell me what's going on." "What happened?" "Vince called me and made me an offer," I said. "It's twice what you're paying me to do Madison Square Garden television and manage." WWF managers in those days worked only TV, and they'd go home and get paid for every town their man was at. I would have less travel and could be home with my daughter, who was 5 at the time. Vern made me an offer. "I don't know where I'll get it," he said. "But I'll get it to you." I knew he meant well, but he's still business. I think he liked me, but I told him, "I have to look out for myself now. You have a big home on Lake Minnetonka. You have all this land and money. I want that. Now is my chance to advance myself and have it. I'll finish out my dates," I told Vern. "But I won't work with Brad Rheingans." The reason I wouldn't work with Brad is because he was new. Vern had just started him and had donated a lot of money to the Olympic Committee. Brad's an Olympian from Minnesota. Vern is from Minnesota. Vern probably told him that he would give him the belt someday. Brad didn't know me. I didn't know him. I didn't want him out there breaking my leg or neck accidentally on purpose. He's the only man I didn't trust, but not because I felt he was dishonest. He was so green and young and might have hurt me not knowing what he was doing. I finished off my dates. On my last night, I thanked Vern for everything. I was done with the AWA. These days, when I see Vern, he thanks me for finishing up dates. He told me, "You're the only guy who gave me proper notice." I consider him a friend to this day. But if I thought they were going to hurt me or touch me on the day I gave my notice, I was going to take that blade and cut the top of my own head off. Let the court sort it out. I think Vince McMahon thought he could come in and buy everybody out and they'd all get scared and run. He thought that someone would give him a fight, either Vern, Fritz von Erich, Eddie Graham, Bill Watts, or someone else. But their mentality was gone. They all had to have money, because they never gave it to the boys. They didn't have the ability to create like Vince. They couldn't keep up with him. They were still stuck in the 60s, and Vince was going into the new century. The mentality of a promoter in those days was to spend the least amount of money to draw the most. Vince already had the money from his father and investments he had made. I didn't get much heat for jumping to the WWF. I did get a call from Harley Race, who was a promoter at that time in Kansas City for the NWA. He said, "Bobby, I hear you're going to New York. We've been friends for 30 years. You can't do this to us." "Harley," I said, "I've got to look out for myself and my family." He agreed and wished me the best of luck. In the end, the wrestlers didn't care what a guy did because they knew that if the opportunity came to them, they would do it too. You had to do it for yourself. In pro wrestling, there is no insurance, no benefits, and no retirement. Besides, when I got to the WWF, I was seeing guys I worked with before, like John Studd, Sergeant Slaughter, and Pat Patterson. It wasn't. This is the end of this conversion. Be sure to comment and subscribe. See you next time.